What is wrong with Donald Trump? What is wrong with the President of the United States? That is what most of America is wondering today. After the President of the United States tweeted one of the ugliest statements he has ever made in a long lifetime of very ugly statements. The tweet was met with outrage by former director of the CIA, John Brennan, who will join us later in this hour, and countless political commentators on television and online. Democrats across the country expressed outrage, and Republicans, as usual, were virtually silent. There was one Republican tweet out of the United States Senate about the president's tweet today from retiring Senator Jeff Flake saying this kind of language is unbecoming of a president of the United States. There's no excuse for it, and Republicans should not be okay with it. That's it. That's what the Republicans had to say. The president's language that Jeff Flake is talking about included calling a person a dog. The tweet was, of course, about Omarosa, who, as part of a publicity tour for her book about working in the Trump campaign in the Trump White House, released an audio recording on television this morning in which she and two other women campaign operatives discussed how to handle the possible revelation of an audio recording of Donald Trump using the N-word. All of the women in the discussion, especially Omarosa and Katrina Pearson, assumed that such a recording probably did exist. And they were absolutely certain that Donald Trump knew that he had used the N-word.
I'm trying to find out at least what context it was used in to help us maybe try to figure out a way to spin it.
I said, well, sir, can you think of any time that this might have happened? And he said no.
Well, that's not true.
How do you he goes, how do you think I should handle it? And I told him exactly what you just said, Omarosa, which is, well, it depends on what scenario you're talking about. And he said, well, why don't you just go ahead and put it to bed? I don't know what the scandal is. No, he said it. He's embarrassed.
There is nothing more important to know about a president than the president's mental. Omarosa is the one who is giving us the clearest picture of the president's current mental state, not by anything she says in her book or in her interviews, but by what she is provoking the president himself to say, what she is provoking the president to reveal about himself. Donald Trump is now and always has been throughout his life the most damaging witness against Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is doing it again. With Omarosa's publicity tour underway, in which she switches sides from Trump defender to Trump accuser, accusing the president of being a racist, the president did everything he possibly could today to support the charge that he is a racist when he tweeted this at 7:31 a.m., right after Omarosa played that tape on television of campaign operatives sharing her belief that Donald Trump did indeed use the N-word. Now, I'm going to leave that tweet on the screen for you in the television audience to read, but I apologize to our listeners on Sirius XM radio at the moment because I'm not going to read this one aloud. It is just too disgusting. And saying these words of Donald Trump would sicken me. Donald Trump's personal attacks on Twitter used to amuse me when they were aimed at me. I was the first person in television news that Donald Trump decided to attack on Twitter when I started saying Donald Trump was not as rich as he claimed to be. He threatened to sue me on Twitter then. I responded that he would never sue me because he couldn't afford it, because he's not as rich as he says he is. That was in 2011. Donald Trump continued to attack me in 2011. And for years after that, because I was the first and for a very long time the only person calling Donald Trump a liar because of his relentless lying about President Obama's birth certificate, I used Twitter to invite Donald Trump onto this program, knowing that he would refuse because he would only do television interviews that he believed he could control, and so our exchanges were limited to Twitter. In December of 2011, he said that I was not long for TV, and he has a face made for radio. In 2012, he called me the dumbest political commentator on television, said I will soon be thrown off the air. He called me too stupid, the dumbest man on TV, a very dumb guy, and a fool. But he never called me a dog. Why didn't he go all the way with me? Why did he stop far short of calling me an animal, a dog. What did I do to deserve his mercy? Well, for one thing, I'm white. So, were we seeing the outburst of a lifelong racist today who believes that substituting the word dog for the N-word is his presidential way of cleaning up his racism for public consumption? Is that what this week's news has provoked? A look into the racist mind of Donald Trump? Or is it a look into an increasingly crazed and dangerous mind? If you worried about the workings of Donald Trump's mind when you listened to him pathologically lying about President Obama's birth certificate, he hasn't gotten any better. If you worried about the workings of Donald Trump's mind during his speech announcing his candidacy for the presidency, he hasn't gotten any better. If you worried about the workings of Donald Trump's mind in the first year of his presidency, he hasn't gotten any better. He's getting worse. There is something seriously wrong with the President of the United States, and it is getting worse. Last year saw the publication of this book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. That was a big bestseller. Some of the authors of that book told us on this program last year that the president was going to get worse as the pressures around him increased, including the investigative pressures brought by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller. They were right. Donald Trump's tweet today was a plea for sympathy from his voters and supporters to the people who he promised he would hire, the very best people, and bring them into the White House. Today, he said that it was his decision as president to hire a person who he then says he knew was crazed at the time. That was his word, crazed. And he says he did it because he wanted to give a crazed friend of his a break. The break he wanted to give her was a $180,000 a year job in the White House where she would be paid exactly the same as the White House chief of staff, the highest pay grade in the White House. Donald Trump told his followers today that instead of giving it to one of the best people, he gave it to a crazed person, an unqualified person, just to give her a break. In other words, he was giving away $180,000 of their taxpayer money to someone he knew did not deserve it and could not earn it. That was his story today. And that is one of the very definitions of the swamp that Donald Trump promised to drain, giving top-paid government jobs to your unqualified friends. Very, very swampy thing. But Donald Trump told that to his followers today because he believes that he has twisted their minds to the point where they would read that poisonous tweet and think, what a nice guy. He tried to give a crazed friend a break. How deeply crazy is that? How crazed is the thinking? How perverse is the working of the mind that composed that presidential tweet this morning? And what does it mean for the country and the world that the most incompetent, most ignorant, the most emotionally unstable president in history is not getting better? He is getting much, much worse. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.